From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead for you today, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney is joined by the University of Nebraska's Karla Wilke. They'll discuss confined cow herd feeding when pastures run out of forage, looking at the feedstuffs that can work well for that purpose. Then K-State's Justin Waggoner on keeping safety at the forefront when harvesting and putting up feedlot silage in the coming weeks. He points out that the fast-paced activity at silage harvest time is ripe for dangerous hazards. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Raymond Cloyd returns to talk about more insects that are damaging landscape trees and ornamentals currently and what to do about them. All that here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Thanks for listening. This is Agriculture Today. Well, recent rainfall notwithstanding, dry pasture conditions have been prevalent in parts of Kansas and the Central Plains region this summer. That leaves a cow-calf producer to ponder options for sustaining the herd nutritionally when grass is spare. The idea of confined cow herd feeding was explored in depth in one of the recent podcasts hosted by K-State beef systems specialist Jaymelynn Farney, part of her highly successful new series called Dr. J's Beef. Jaymelynn introduces her guest.
Today, I have asked Dr. Karla Wilke to be our guest. She's an associate professor and range management cow-calf specialist at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center for the University of Nebraska, or UNL. I've invited Karla to visit about confined cow feeding, as her and her group have done quite a bit of research and have looked at it as a management option. Now, I usually think about confined cow management primarily just as a drought alternative or something to do to keep your cow herd together if you run out of forage availability. Karla, when might producers look at this as a management option for their operation?
So I think of confined cow as a system for production cows that are still having baby calves at side and can be a management tool for people who are always kind of limited on grass. There are a lot of producers who really don't have the acres of grass to consistently run the number of cows that they would like to be able to really make that a part of the enterprise or its own little profit center. And so being able to utilize some time frame of confined cow feeding for those cows. So it might be a period of time where they do go out on grass for a little while, but not the entire summer like somebody might do with a lot of grass. And then they come into confinement for a while, and then maybe they've got some annual forages they planted that are available, and they utilize those in some way for the cow herd. Then maybe they've got crop residues, and they go out on those with the cow herd for a while, and when they don't have that, they come back in confinement. And so at any given time in that cow's production cycle, she may be dry, she may be calving, she may be nursing a calf, she may have a calf that's about ready to wean. She may spend part of her life in this confinement sector of the whole system, or it may be a drought mitigation tool for those who normally would have grass and don't this particular year. And so I think the goals of those two systems are a little different, but I think we can make it work for either one.
So now that we have some ideas of when you might be interested in using confined cow production, what would you say are some of the major steps to start implementing a system such as this?
So one of the major things that's going to be important if somebody wants to have a sector or a segment of their production system that involves the confined cow feeding system is to evaluate what feed resources they have available to them and what type of equipment they have available to mix or grind or to weigh out feed properly and then feed it. A lot of what we have done our research on is limiting the amount of dry matter that the cow consumes, but making that limit-fed diet energy dense, protein dense, all the nutrient dense, I should really say, so that it supplies all the nutrients that the cow needs, whether she's in lactation or gestation or whatever, but that she doesn't get to eat everything she wants. And so it might help producers to think of that in terms of, I can eat a whole bunch of carrot sticks or I can eat a little bitty piece of cake and come up with the same calories. And so it's kind of that concept because we know that a production cow, a mama cow in production will eat everything you give her. And so she almost seems like at times she doesn't have a limit on that upper end, And so that just feeding that cow in confinement can get really expensive. And so being able to have a set of scales where you can weigh out how much you intend to give her and to mix the ration well so that it is as nutrient dense as possible. And putting together some things on paper as to what it would cost you to get some feed resources to do that. A lot of producers that this appeals to as part of a general system and not just a drought management tool are already growing some of those feed resources. So they may be putting up their own silage, or they may be having some crop residues that they can grind up and put in the feed, and then maybe they're very close to an ethanol plant or something that's not a lot of expense for them to get. If you are way out in the middle of nowhere, all you do in the winter is roll out a bale of hay and put out some cubes, then this is going to be a really difficult system to implement without equipment to make that happen.
And so you immediately started on the nutrition side, which, you're a nutritionist just as I. So from the nutrition perspective, what are some diets that you kind of have looked at and like for these cows in confinement? And I know those will change depending on production stage, but what are some things some producers should look into getting a hold of?
For us, what works well is to have some ground wheat straw or cornstalk residue ground up in that diet. That's usually a cheaper forage source than alfalfa hay or millet or something like that. So we'll use that because it's cheaper. It provides some bulk, so the cow feels full, even though we are limit feeding her, doesn't go through her rumen rapidly. And then we will mix that with some wet distillers, and that makes that residue, which isn't really normally very palatable to that cow. And so those are usually kind of the base ingredients to that. And I have helped producers do all kinds of goofy things to the diet from there. This last year in western Nebraska, we had, just so you know, 2019, 2020 have been awful in agriculture. So we had a really hard early freeze in October on our sugar beets. And so we had a whole bunch of sugar beets that were not acceptable for human consumption sugar. So we chopped up sugar beets and we mixed them with straw and we threw them in those cow diets. And we got those sugar beets pretty cheap. Most producers were able to get them very inexpensively. So we just kind of, whatever we could do, we put in there. I've used sugar beet pulp, which is the byproduct after that. People use sweet bran. We've used silage to add to the diet. I actually kind of like the silage in the diet. You mentioned the difference between, lactation and gestation. And when there's a higher energy need and maybe a little more intake needs to be there, I don't mind adding a little silage to that diet at that time. And a lot of times silage is fairly cheap, for a producer. That may be one of their cheaper resources. And so if they've got it and that's what's cheap, we'll stick it in there.
And of all of those ingredients you've mentioned, most of them have a pretty heavy wet component or very little dry matter. Why is that?
Those are, I guess those are inherent to those products, to the silage and the sugar and everything. But what I like about that is that it allows me to mix it with that very dry straw and make about a 45-50% dry matter ration. that's just almost ideal for coming out of a mixer and for having some appeal to the cows and that kind of thing. And their consumption of that is usually really good. Very little sorting in that, especially if you're limit feeding just a little bit. So I do like that. People ask about, what if I use some dried distillers? And you can, but when you mix dried distillers with dry wheat straw or dry cornstalk residue, it's going to all end up in the bottom of the bunk, and the boss cow is going to get it all. And you're going to have some really thin cows that never got anything. And so I guess one of the things I like about being able to have a wetter ration, whether that's dried distillers and then I mix in a little silage, or, if it's wet distillers and straw or whatever, is that it kind of keeps those cows from doing that sorting thing of the really good stuff.
Now, Karla, I also have a lot of producers ask me, do I have to put my cows in a feedlot or build an expensive hoop or covered facility to take care of my cows in confinement? What would you say if you had a producer ask that?
I guess my answer to that is no. Even if you're in a drought situation, you don't have to go to a feedlot. You could use a pivot corner. You could use fallow ground. You could use a residue field. Like this time of year, wheat's coming off. Stick them out there, put a hot fence up, shoot your ration under a hot fence line where they can't really sit in it and poop on it and everything. They kind of have to stand in line there and eat it, something like that. I mean, that's pretty simple. That's inexpensive. That's not even bunk space. That's just feeding on the ground. So no, you can get pretty creative. Honestly, you probably need to get them out of the pasture. We have done some research where we can feed on the pasture and replace some of the grass they eat with a mixture of distillers and residues or hays or something. But you're not going to replace all of it most likely. And so to prevent damage from that pasture, you can do that early on to stretch the pasture, but there's going to come a point where you're still going to have to get them out of that pasture. And that's when you may want to go to a pivot corner or a residue field or fallow ground or something, or go back to their calving ground or something.
University of Nebraska cow-calf nutritionist Karla Wilke there, talking with K-State's Jaymelynn Farney. Further on in this podcast, they took up several other facets of confined cow herd feeding. Give it a listen by searching for Dr. J's Beef, or there's a link at southeast.ksu.edu. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. We are very steadily approaching that time now where you cattle producers in particular may well be putting up your silage. Well, there are some considerations on the process and going about it in the right way we want to take on now. Joining us is Justin Waggoner. Justin is the Research and Extension Beef Systems Specialist for K-State, based in southwest Kansas, where we see silage processing activity in the coming weeks anyway, out in the feed yard settings, Justin. So you had some things you wanted to talk up in as far as harvesting and so forth, things that you think typically go overlooked when we get around to this time of the year.
Yeah, Eric, one of the big things that I think we often overlook is, especially as cattle producers, maybe is just safety and general safety, disregarding any number of things that go around our operation. And, if we look at silage harvest, that's going to be one of the busiest, probably one of the most fast-paced operations that we participate in all year. We've got cutters and choppers in the field. We've got trucks, multiple trucks, that are running up and down the road from the field to the pile or to the bunker. We've probably got 2 to 3 pack tractors on a large operation that's going to be packing those large piles. You couple that with the speed at which we can harvest silage today. I mean, if you've ever watched some of these cutters in the field, you'll see 10 trucks and 2 cutters, and everything is It's a well-oiled machine, to say the least. And so I think anytime you combine, lots of equipment, on most operations, silage harvest is going to be done by a custom contractor. Their employees are probably not going to be familiar with the feedlot or the operation that they're working with and kind of the normal workflow there. As you look at where our silage piles are at, they tend to be, near the mill, places where we've got a lot of activity on the operation anyways. And so, in terms of some risk of things happening, there's certainly the potential for some of those things to become unsafe rather quickly. We combine, heavy equipment, people, and speed and long hours. We're probably ripe for an accident at that point. So I think safety is something we need to certainly keep in the front of our mind as we get into this time of year.
Well, with the flurry of activity that surrounds silage processing, packing, what would you consider some of the flash points in as far as hazards?
Yeah, so I think one of the big ones, and I take this one from Dr. Keith Bolson, who recently passed away. So, one of his big messages was silage safety in general was don't become complacent. And I think that the frame that I'm going to put that in is we've got to have a certain degree of situational awareness. There's lots of what I'd call highly repetitive operations in putting up silage. If we look at the guys in the fields running the cutters, the guys in the trucks, the pack tractor operators driving back and forth up and down that pile, staying aware of those surroundings. If there is people that have changed or something changes with that workflow. Another big factor that I think also comes into this is fatigue. Long hours in the field, just like with any type of harvest. That in itself, there's a certain risk associated with that. Cell phone use is another one, among those folks, and just being distracted, I think is a huge thing. So, complacency, staying aware of one's surroundings, and really focusing on the job at hand, I think is an important one of the important areas to focus on.
Silage harvest can be somewhat monotonous, and that opens up the door for entertaintiveness.
Yeah, and we've all been there. We know how that's like. Anybody that's ever spent hours in a tractor kind of knows what that can be like. The other area that I start to think about is, here in western Kansas, a lot of those silage trucks are going to be going up and down our county and rural roads. It's a time of year usually where the crops are tall. Our visibility at the intersections is limited. There's been several occasions here in western Kansas where we do see some accidents that, unfortunately, we could tie back to our silage harvesting practices. There's more trucks on the road. So it's certainly something to be aware of. Just in terms of safety for our neighbors, one of the things you never want to be the feed yard that gets the call from your neighbors down the road of, hey, those silage trucks are just zipping past the stop sign. To stay aware at those intersections, maybe drivers, taking an extra minute to slow down just a little bit as they're coming up on those houses. I think that's always a good reminder for the silage crews as well, to be kind to our neighbors when we're out there. Another big one that, sometimes we see is we get some extra people during silage harvest that want to congregate on foot around that pile or around that area where we're working.
Mm-hmm.
On a silage pile, especially if you're the pack tractor driver, visibility sometimes is not the best. And so we just need to be aware that if there is people that are going to be on foot, we need to get on the radio or get on the cell phone if that's what we're using as our means of communication and kind of let everybody know. It's probably also not a bad idea if you've got a piece of equipment that's broken down where you're going to have people working on it around that pile to get a vest on them. Really increase that visibility so that people can see them. I think that's huge. That's a common source of accidents during silage harvest is people that are on foot in the area near the pile or in that vicinity.
Well, Justin, you mentioned the bunker scene there. In as far as packing silage in and of itself, some things need to be thought of there, too. You mentioned visibility being limited on those pack tractors, but there are other things that can work into this likewise. Overfilling bunkers could be a potential hazard and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And, really it's just not a good idea from a lot of different perspectives to overfill a bunker silo. One, it increases the likelihood of that tractor potentially rolling over, going over the side. That pack tractor, if you're up there on the edge, typically that's an area where we don't see a lot of visibility. It's really difficult to see. We have some low visibility there. The other thing that's actually always kind of maybe hit me a little bit as a nutritionist is that, that silage along the edge of that or over and above the wall really doesn't get packed all that well. So it really doesn't make very good silage. That edge of the silage is more unstable a lot of times and it's more likely to collapse. So as you look at that overfilling that bunker silo or, really it just doesn't make sense from a lot of reasons, from a safety perspective, but also from just a quality of the end product that we're going to get. It doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. The other thing that I often remind producers, not just with a bunker silo, but as we go to drive over piles. Very common, good way of putting up silage. But one of the things I see is we want to build those piles, bigger and bigger and bigger, it seems like, here in western Kansas. And we can really get some silage drive over piles once again that are very high. And they may exceed the ability of our equipment on the operation to access the top of that pile. And so that's something to think about, as we're putting that up. Are we at a point where maybe we need to start a second pile, move over, being sensitive to what's the maximum reach of our loader bucket or our silo rake that we're going to use, silage rake, to take that off of there. So, just some things to think about there as we put it up. It does take a lot of space, but, we also need to keep those piles manageable to some extent for our people.
For, as you mentioned, Dr. Bolson's work on silage safety and those avalanches that can occur come feeding time, why those have to be avoided at all costs.
Yeah, and one of the common areas that we see that happen is when the height of that pile, exceeds that equipment, we start to undercut that silage, which really the way we're accessing at that point is really creating an avalanche, which we're creating the very situation that we'd really like to stay away from. The other thing is, as we kind of talk about the drive over piles, would be the slopes. As we think about tractor rollovers, and this may apply somewhat in the bunkers as well, but that slope of for every 1 foot of rise, we want to have about 3 foot of run. So that 1 to 3 slope, even 1 to 4 is a really good idea. That's generally considered to be pretty safe and not get those abrupt drop-offs coming off the pile.
All of this revolves back around to awareness, in essence.
Absolutely.
And so that's why we're sharing it with producers and others today, with those silage cutters rolling soon, with the trucks rolling soon, and with the packing tractors operational. Why a lot going on during this important time in bringing in this key feedstuff for our feed yards out there in Kansas. Silage harvest forthcoming here soon. Good points to bring up. And Justin, thanks for joining us right here.
Thanks again, Eric.
That's from Justin Waggoner. As you know, he's a beef systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension based in southwest Kansas. And just to add ahead of the break that the aforementioned K-State animal scientist, the late Keith Bolson, and his wife Ruthie, before Keith's passing a couple of months back, founded the Keith Bolson Silage Safety Foundation to promote safety education, because Keith was passionate about that safety cause during his time as the world's foremost authority on silage production and management. You can find out more about that foundation at silagesafety.org, silagesafety.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Eric Atkinson with you. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines in brief, courtesy in part of DTN. Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey filed a bill this week that would suspend all current and future line speed waivers for meatpacking plants during the pandemic, in line with a companion House bill from Representative Marcia Fudge of Ohio and others. The legislation would cover both meat and poultry processing. Quoting Booker here, the situation has only worsened since the USDA has approved nearly 20 requests from meatpacking plants to exceed regulatory limits on the line speeds, despite the risks posed to workers, consumers, and animal welfare, again, in Booker's words. However, the idea of slowing line speeds is being met with pushback from the U.S. meat industry. Smithfield Foods CEO Ken Sullivan said that slowing those line speeds by 50% means euthanizing half of the nation's livestock, the collapse of farm prices, burying food in the ground, food insecurity, and higher food prices for everyone, including, most importantly, those that can least afford it, in Sullivan's words. What sectors of the beef industry are enjoying positive margins and which ones are not? The observations of one USDA economist right here, and from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
The beef industry is making a gradual return to at least a modicum of normalcy after those major disruptions in April and May, part of June. But what parts of the business are seeing positive margins? What parts are running in the red? We asked USDA's livestock analyst Shale Shagam for his view on that, starting with beef processors and working back to cow-calf operators.
Right now, packer margins are still positive. They've come down dramatically from what they were, when we had tight supplies of beef and limited slaughter capacity, but they are still positive. The most recent information we have for feedlots would be through June, and their returns were negative.
And for cow-calf operators, their returns right now are what Shagam calls
not stellar,
but on an annual basis,
they are slightly positive,
with average prices running roughly only about $1 a hundredweight less than this time a year ago. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Back on Capitol Hill, Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa is keeping up the pressure on the EPA over biofuels, this time shifting her attention to the issue of E15 and expanding the availability of that fuel after the EPA changed its rules to allow for year-round sales of that higher ethanol blend. In a letter to EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler, Ernst pointed out that the infrastructure issues for E15 are not necessarily valid, she says, noting that all steel fuel tanks and fiberglass tanks put in service since 1990 are approved for up to 100% ethanol. Ernst stating that given the lifespan of underground tanks, almost every underground fuel tank should be able to handle E15 and higher blends of ethanol. Meanwhile, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa said that aid for the U.S. biofuel sector may come down to decisions made by USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. The latest aid package provides $20 billion to the Secretary to help agricultural producers, growers, and processors. Grassley says it will be up to the Secretary to determine if that includes the biofuels sector. And world wheat and corn harvests next year will be slightly lower than expected. This according to the International Grains Council, leading it to cut its forecast for total grains production. The IGC, in its monthly report released today, said that the 2021 grain harvest is estimated to yield 2.2 billion metric tons. That would be 13 million tons less than projected last month. That revision is driven by smaller than expected wheat and corn harvest, according to the IGC. It said global wheat harvest would produce 762 million tons. That would be 6 million tons less than its previous estimate, and corn harvest would produce 1.2 billion tons, 5 million tons less than previous estimates. Despite the downgrade, the IGC still expects next year's harvest to be the largest on record and 48 million tons larger than this year's. The change means that the IGC now expects carryover stocks to be 625 million tons next year, 10 million tons less than previous forecasts. Still the largest since the 2017 and 18 production season. Well, coming your way now, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And waiting with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Joining us is Lavelle Windsor from Grantville, who serves as a volunteer with Common Ground Kansas. And Lavelle, you've been with Common Ground Kansas, serving as a volunteer since almost the very beginning since 2011, and you've seen a lot of great activities throughout the years.
I was one of the first volunteers with Kansas, and we have, grown and evolved to see how reaching the consumer from the farm perspective might look. And so we did a lot of different activities in the early years and eventually have found that one activity that is very appealing to consumers is doing yoga on the farm. And so this year that we're in right now, our main activities that were planned on the farm to reach consumers were to bring people out to the farm and do yoga on the farm events, which has been very well received over the last few years.
Of course, in the times that we're in right now, you had to move that to a virtual type of an event.
Yes, there was a pretty big pivot from doing on-farm yoga on the farm, where it was mostly the moms who were involved in those activities and coming out to the farm, to what the venue ended up being was a virtual activity where we would have a yoga instructor and then a few of the volunteers, and the yoga might be more geared toward young children, and then the Common Ground volunteers were in between the yoga, were sharing their farm animals or the plants on their farm. It was kind of a little different twist to it than what we had done in the past.
But a great way still to get exposure to agriculture, to get exposure to animals, and to really show some of that everyday life.
Yes, and especially when you have kids who are getting to see that, they are so excited, and sometimes you really get even better conversations because, for one thing, kids aren't afraid to ask, and sometimes you get to share some things with even their parents that they may not know or look at it in a little bit different light.
And Lavelle, if people want to know more information about Common Ground Kansas, what's the best way they can do that?
There is the website that is Common Ground Now, or also just looping to the Kansas Soybean Association. There are links there as well.
That is Lavelle Windsor from Grantville. She serves as a volunteer with Common Ground Kansas, and she joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Many thanks, Greg. Greg Akagi there. And we'll be back after this break. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
For you now on Agriculture Today, this week's horticulture segment, as we bring back in Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. And he'll serve up information on still more insects we find currently in lawn and garden. Something that we briefly touched upon previously, but let's get caught up on it, Raymond. Green June beetles are prominent and numerous out there right now, you say.
Yes, the adults are quite prevalent. People are noticing them, Eric. They're those big green beetles, kind of dull green, that run into people and fly around, hover above the lawn. And people don't understand that they can, be somewhat damaging. Well, not the same as Japanese beetle, but they will feed on oak leaves. They will feed on fruit, apricot, peach, and apple, and things like that. But really, there's not much you can do about them. I mean, because they're so mobile, spraying is not very effective. If you want to get your kids out of the house, you can give them badminton rackets and go out there and they can swat them. But really, just don't confuse it with Japanese beetle. Japanese beetle we'll talk about is smaller, and these things are larger. Their larvae are in the ground, and they primarily feed on organic matter. But just be aware of them. They're very easy to handpick and then put in some soapy water if the numbers are not too high.
As you say, though, they might be confused with another beetle, Japanese beetles, and we do know that they can wreak havoc out there, don't they?
Absolutely. Japanese beetle is ravaging grape leaves right now, and they're feeding on roses and anything in the Rosaceae family, which is based on the chemical nature of that group of plants. And generally, in order to avoid damage to your roses, you have to spray. And unfortunately, the insecticides that we recommend, which includes 7, is harmful to many of the natural enemies and pollinators, such as bumblebees and honeybees. And of course, it's always important to preserve those. You can handpick them, physically remove them. And again, like green June beetle adults, put them in some soapy water, and that should kill them.
But when you're dealing with thousands of these beetles, it really becomes a little maybe unpractical to do that.
But as you say, that non-selective insecticide may be the only ticket, because these can create enough damage to be extraordinarily detrimental to, say, roses or other ornamentals and set them back considerably.
Well, they'll make them they won't look very well aesthetically. Overall, a rose with all its petals eaten will not be good for a show. However, I want to say that if you spray too much, too often, too frequently with some of these insecticides that are available, you can stimulate outbreaks of spider mites because you're killing all the natural enemies or the beneficial insects that are out there. So if you're spraying once a week for Japanese beetle, you run the risk of having a two-spotted spider mite infestation. We don't recommend the Japanese beetle traps because they have been shown to lure more Japanese beetles into an area. If you'd like, you could give them to your neighbors, except you, and let them deal with them. But we do not recommend Japanese beetle traps. The data, the science is out there indicating that when you use them, place them among your plants, you will sustain more damage than if you had not used them.
Important to know right there. Well, something that we have not talked up this summer yet anyway, mimosa webworms. Well, what are these about, Raymond?
Yeah, mimosa webworm is a caterpillar pest. It attacks honey locust and sometimes silk tree. They're out there right now, and if you look up and you see a honey locust and the leaves are brown, they're folded together like in webs, that's mimosa webworm. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can do right now because the larvae are inside those folds and they're protected from any type of insecticide spray. The upside is that really they're only making the plants look not what I call aesthetically pleasing, but they're not going to have any long-term effects on the plants. But next year, you need to be out there early looking for the caterpillars, and then you can use one of the standard insecticides for caterpillars, such as dipel or one with the active ingredient spinosad to kill the caterpillars. But at this point, there's nothing you can do.
Are these easily distinguished from other webworms then, Raymond?
Well, when we look at the fall webworm and the eastern tint caterpillar, they primarily are feeding, or their damage is associated with honey locust and silk tree, where the other ones are attacking, let's say, for example, fall webworm will attack hickory and walnut, and then eastern tint caterpillar attacks anything in the rosaceae family, apples, cherries, plums, things like that. So you can base it on the host tree, Eric, but they're very different from what the fall webworm and eastern tint caterpillar look like. The leaves are folded together. They're brown. It looks like you took a blowtorch to the tree at that point.
Again, that's the mimosa webworm. Be watching out for it if you've those aforementioned tree species. And squash bugs and squash vine borer. We've visited those topics earlier, but bring us an update on each of these, if you would, Raymond.
Well, Eric, they're both out in abundant numbers. I've been out to the community gardens, and the squash bug adults, nymphs are out, eggs are on the leaf undersides. So they're going great guns right now. Squash vine borer larvae are inside plants. And if you go out to your squash, zucchini, or cucumbers and you find your plants wilting, even though they've been watered, you might want to look at the base and see if there's any green goo material and pull it out. And if you break them apart, you might find some larvae. Once the larvae are inside the plant, Eric, you can't do anything. You just got to throw it away. For squash bugs, you can hand pick, you can squish the eggs, you can vacuum them up, you can place boards in the area, and the adults will hide under there. You can spray, but remember, the eggs and the nymphs are on the leaf underside, so you have to get thorough coverage. Those two insects right now are very prevalent in the garden.
And again, responding to each of those, hopefully you can do something, but in the case of the vine borer, just keeping it from spreading to other plants is the objective right now, right?
Yeah, that's why you pull it out of the ground and you throw it away. I wouldn't put it in the compost unless it's active because it may not kill the larva. The larva, what they will do is, Eric, they'll tunnel out and they'll go into the soil and pupate. So if they do that before they experience the heat of a compost pile, it's really a fruitless task at that time.
Once again, you've plenty of good information to take full advantage of by going to the horticulture website at K-State or the entomology website at K-State. Either one can address these insect issues that we've covered today. Raymond, as always, thanks for the input.
You're welcome, Eric. I look forward to our next visit.
We'll have you back again soon. Horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd of K-State Research and Extension with us on this week's horticulture segment. And with that, our Thursday edition comes to a close. Thanks for tuning in, and please be back with us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.